started. You watched my last video. The last thing I did, it was on kind of the history going back to Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, up to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. During this video, what I basically want to cover, kind of a follow-up on that, and I'll do another one after this. Probably going into a little bit more details to some of the things I covered in the first video. But for this one, I want to do, I want to take a look at the, basically the UN petitions that happened during basically right during the McCarthy era, right after the UN was founded after World War II. There was a string of, from the Civil Rights Congress, the National Negro Congress, and Du Bois by the NAACP, there's a string of petitions. I want to talk about that movement. I want to talk about the importance of that today as far as an international struggle and as far as what I'm working on, and why this is very important to frame this issue around basically a human rights struggle, why it's very important for Black Americans to do that, and the benefits of doing that with regard to, you know, any type of movement in comparison to movements that want to stay domestic in their scope, such as, you know, for reparations or anything else. So I want to bring up my screen again. Okay. And I want to start out with this this speech, February 16th, 1965. This was would have been a little bit before Malcolm X passed away. It's one of the last speeches that he gave, called "Not Just an American Problem, but a World Problem." And during this speech, he's basically and a couple of speeches before that, going back to his mission, basically to found the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which basically was based off the Organization of African Unity, when he went and met with all the African leaders and discussed international issues. He was coming back to the United States. He was trying to internationalize the issue of human rights in the United States, from a civil rights issue to an issue of human rights, and get basically the UN and other the international community involved in the struggle versus just the struggle between basically you know, Blacks in America and, you know, the government of the United States. So I'm not going to read this entire thing, so you know where it's at. It's Malcolm X blogspot, Malcolm X Files blogspot.com. You'll see speeches, and it'll give you the whole list of speeches. This is not just an American problem, but a world problem. You could also Google "not just American problem, but a world problem." You can find the whole speech probably on any site that, you know, documents this type of stuff. You know, any type of Malcolm X site, any type of, you know, historical site, colleges, universities probably got this in certain archives or whatever. But I'm going to try to scroll down. I'm going to try to find this section. There's a couple of different sections of things discussed by Malcolm in this speech that's relevant to today, especially. And if I can't find it really quickly, I'll have to fix this in editing, but let me see. Okay, I'm gonna start right here. Since the Civil Rights Bill, I used to see African diplomats at the UN crying out against the injustice that was being done to Black people in Mozambique and Angola, Congo, South Africa, and I was wondering why and how they could go back to their hotels and turn on the TV and see dogs biting Black people right down the block, and policemen wrecking the stores of Black people with their clubs right down the block, and putting water hoses on Black people with pressure so high it ripped their clothes off right down the block. And I wonder how they could talk all that talk about what was happening in Angola, Mozambique, and the rest, to see it happening right down the block, and get up on the podium about the UN, in front of the UN, and not say anything about it. But I went, discussed it with some of them, and they said, as long as the Black man in America calls a struggle for civil rights, or of civil rights, that in the civil rights context, it's domestic and it remains within the jurisdiction of the United States. And if any of them open up their mouths to say anything about it, it's considered a violation of the laws and the rules of protocol. And the difference with other people was that they didn't call their grievances civil rights grievances. They called them human rights grievances. Civil rights are within the jurisdiction of the government where they're involved. But human rights is a part of the United Nations. All the nations that signed the Charter of the UN came up with the Declaration of Human Rights. And anyone who classifies as grievances under the label of human rights violations, those grievances can be brought into the United Nations and can be discussed by all people all over the world. For as long as you call it civil rights, your only allies can be people in the next community, many of whom are responsible for their grievances. But when you call it human rights, it becomes international. And then you can take your troubles to the World Court. You can take them before the world, and anybody, anywhere on this earth can become your ally. So one of the first steps that we became involved in, those of us who got into the Organization of Afro-American Unity, was to come up with a program that would make our grievances international and make the world see that our problem was no longer a Negro problem or an American problem, but a human problem, a problem for humanity, a problem which should be attacked by all elements of humanity, a problem that was so complex that it was impossible for Uncle Sam to solve it himself, and therefore we want to get a body or a conference with people who are in such position that they can help us get some kind of adjustment to the situation before it gets so explosive that no one can handle it. Okay. And earlier in the speech, he basically gave the context of as far as, you don't want to go to Uncle Sam to basically, for your grievances about, Uncle Sam. You don't want to go to the government. You don't want to go to the U.S. for grievances about the U.S., thinking that the U.S. is going to convict themselves of crimes that they are committing against you, right? So his language here, because if I scroll up a little bit, you're going to notice that, and even subsequently within international law, you'll notice that the language he's using is very precise. And it might not seem precise, it might not seem exact, it might not seem like he's trying to make like lawyerly type points, but really he is. The way he's framing this issue is very strategic. From a legal perspective, not just, from a strategic perspective as far as gaining rights, that too, but even from a legal perspective, from a perspective of, his relationship to how he's framing it compared to the United States and how other countries, like he said, when you view it as a civil rights issue, other countries or, any country that has a problem domestically, if you approach their issue, from the outside, that country feels like, they're having their toes stepped on. Internationally, it's kind of like he said, rules of protocol, right? So you can't just go around, like the United States does a lot and just kind of intervene in other people's affairs. Sometimes even, depending on what you do, that could be a violation of international law in and of itself, depending on how aggressive tactics you take unilaterally without the rest of the UN, especially. That could become a violation of international law. Oh, if you take military action, it can become a war crime. So, and like I said, just protocol and just kind of like international respect. If an issue is domestic, it has to be handled domestic. But also on top of that, under criteria of the UN, under international protocols as well, UN protocols for either petitioning or filing complaints, the standards involve whether or not the issue is such an issue that it can no longer fall within the jurisdiction of this particular state because of the nature of the crimes, because of the severity, because of what kind of remedies are available within your home country, and what past remedies you tried to enact, were they successful, were they not successful, basically, can the host state, the home state, this being accused of these crimes, of international crimes, of crimes against humanity, of human rights violations, Can they handle it domestically? Can it be handled domestically? Or is it being handled domestically? Or is it being framed as being handled domestically? And if we as people, if Black people in general want their issues to be addressed from a human rights perspective internationally, we have the right to do that. We have the rights under international law to do that, to put pressure on the United States. And that's what Malcolm X was trying to do. So it wasn't just, a strategy as far as, he was looking at the civil rights movement and seeing other people. That was part of it, but it was also part of a wider strategy for actually getting the international community involved. And sometimes people might have a problem with this as far as they feel that the UN can't do anything, but really the UN has an obligation to do something. And they could choose not to. They could choose to ignore the issues. But what you'll see a trend of the United States doing is they'll have movements in other countries, either, CIA operations or just actual legit movements, or, both of the two combined, both of the two type of movements combined. Like there might be a legitimate movement for freedom in a country, legitimate grievances, but then they might throw a terrorist group on top of it, right? If you want to look at the Hong Kong situation, because people always say like, certain countries are afraid to call other countries because then they'll call out, human rights violations in their country. But, whether it's the Muslims in China, whether it was, the Hong Kong situation, the United States, if there's a group of people in that country complaining about grievances, they'll say something about it. And depending on the actual claims being made, the severity of the claims, in reality, that could, have a basically an effect on the reaction. Because obviously, the more serious the crimes, the more serious the reaction could be. The more legitimate the crimes, versus in situations where they know that it could be, just an operation to try to get a negative view of another country, but they're not really trying to actually address the issues as far as, filing any type of legitimate claims or going to any type of military action. But here's the part that I was talking about, okay? And the motto of the Organization of Afro-American Unity is by any means necessary, right? We don't believe in fighting a battle that's going to in which the ground rules are being laid down by those who suppress us, right? We don't believe that we can win a battle where the ground rules are laid down by those who exploit us. We don't believe that we can carry out a struggle trying to win the affection of those for so long who've oppressed and exploited us. We believe that our fight is just. We believe that our grievances are just. See, like I was saying, he's using this type of language. I mean, he really had his stuff figured out. Obviously it's Malcolm. A lot of people obviously respect, what he brought to the table as far as the leader, obviously what he was willing to sacrifice personally, how he's really willing to put his life on the line. And obviously he had his stuff together as far as what he was going to do with this organization. That's why, they kind of had to take him out when they did. We believe that the evil practices against Black people in this society are criminal. The language again, criminal. And that those who engage in such criminal practices are to be looked upon themselves as nothing but criminals. And we believe that we are within our rights to fight those criminals by any means necessary. This doesn't mean that we're for violence, but we have seen that the federal government has shown its inability, its absolute unwillingness to protect the lives and the property of Black people. We have seen where organized white racists, Klansmen, citizen councilmen, and others have come into the Black community and take the Black man and make him disappear, and nothing is done about it, right? So even there, about the by any means necessary, a lot of people just see it as a slogan, but no, it's actually rooted rather firmly in actual international law and standards that were established either before that or afterwards, and norms and protocols. So before I get into the petitions, I'm going to go ahead and discuss this, why this is fresh. I'm going to show two documents. I'm not going to go through all the UN documents in this video. I'm just going to kind of cover the UN complaint procedures real quick. This is for the United Nations Human Rights Council. So you could submit complaints to the Human Rights Council, right? And I'll just go through some of this. What is the complaint procedure? Advantages of the complaint procedure? What type of complaints are admissible? What violations? Okay. What criteria exhaust the domestic remedies? So who can discipline a complaint? See, this is one of the benefits of this is that any individual, group of individuals, or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, can submit a complaint to the complaint procedure of the Human Rights Council, and the Human Rights Council will take up the issue. And another thing about this procedure specifically is that a complaint can be submitted against any country, irrespective of whether the country has ratified any particular treaty or made reservations under a particular instrument. Because you could say, if you understand international law, one of the things you know that they have specific covenants, treaties, and what have you. And United States and other countries are very often take reservations under the optional protocols and stuff like that. They'll take as far as what they want to incorporate into their law domestically, as far as what they want to be held liable to, as far as the complaint procedures, because there's multiple different complaint procedures for the United Nations. There's different the different treaties, like I mentioned. Each treaty, for example, you have like the Treaty Against Racial Discrimination, Treaty for Civil, Political, Economic, type rights and stuff like that. So under each one of these treaties, you could submit a complaint through that treaty specifically. And there's also, kind of regional courts or regional kind of entities that you could submit the procedures to, special procedures. But if there's a reservation taken under certain procedures, or the country doesn't necessarily hasn't ratified a particular part of the treaty that would allow an individual or a group or whomever to file under that specific treaty, this is a way where you could still do that, where you could still go to the Human Rights Council, and the Human Rights Council could bring the issue back. The next thing that I want to cover really quickly while on this page is, okay, what events are considered patterns of gross human rights violations? This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. The standards are consistent patterns of gross human rights violation. This is the specific legal language that they're using here. And it's going to say what is considered this. Resolutions or decisions of the General Assembly, Human Rights Council, and Economic Social Council do not contain any clear definition of the patterns of gross violations. However, the 503 procedure appears that the term patterns of gross violations were considered as those, in a specific statement, as those that were so severe that they could no longer be regarded as falling exclusively within the domestic jurisdiction of the state. And this is just a recent procedure. Obviously, some of this language existed back then, but you could see that Malcolm X was using that language, right? When he was giving a speech, he was using a specific type of language. And a lot of this is common sense, right? But at the same time, these are the standards of international law. Okay? And he was using that type of language, and this is how he was trying to frame the issue for these other countries to feel obligation to get involved. And going back to like 1940, I think 8-ish, 46, 48, when it was UN was being founded, that's when you had Declaration of Human Rights, you had a UN Charter, and in these documents, they specifically, when I look at the other petitions, you'll see they're citing that type of language. That they was specifically setting up the UN under those type of protocols and purposes. But moreover, gross violations refer to violations of civil, political, and economic, social, cultural rights occurring in any part of the world under any circumstances, including in situations of armed conflict and breaches of international humanitarian law. For the peace, for example, the policy of apartheid fits the definition of consistent patterns of gross violations, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Right, and that's a big one, apartheid, and that's a big one, apartheid, with regard to, the United States, because you could look, and probably the biggest historical, reason for kind of the UN type of thing for it to deal with would be probably the Holocaust or something like that, right? But apartheid would probably be one of the next type biggest ones. And when I said what I would you kind of reference here, to look at would be, the comparison between how blacks were treated in the United States versus how, and I could probably do a video on this specifically at some point in time. I know I posted about this on my Facebook page before, but the comparisons between how Nazi ideas were basically adopted from how blacks were treated in the United States, something similar, I mean, could be, created around South Africa, and how they kind of designed their system of segregation as far as comparisons to how, it was designed in the United States, against blacks specifically. So those are kind of the main things that I wanted to cover here, to kind of get out of this as far as submitting a complaint to the Human Rights Council. And it's just not about submitting to the Human Rights Council or any of the special procedures, any of the treaties or anything like that. Really what it's about is what Malcolm X was talking about, internationalizing the issue. Basically taking the any type of reservation that another country might have, as far as, because there's allies in the world. There's other countries in the world that oppose the U.S. foreign policy. There's other countries in the world that oppose, the way the U.S. bullies them internationally and violates international law with regard to their sovereignty as nations. There's people, in the world who are citizens of countries, who, even if the leaders of those countries that are trying to fight for their own rights, and just by, a group of people in a particular country, especially, black people in America, standing up and demanding international rights, that could spark an international movement. Just the type of, spiritual energy off of, other people seeing that happen. But, South American countries, and when you look at the U.S. behavior with regard to these countries, all these countries when you think about Brazil, or you think about Venezuela, any of these type of countries where you hear about these movements that remove leaders, Iran, what they did in Iraq, what they did with Gaddafi, what they trying to do in Syria, all these different behaviors have a purpose, because they're removing leaders. All these leaders, a lot of these leaders of these specific type of countries have seats in the UN. They have voices internationally. They have voices with regard to the United States. They have, they can affect their own people with their own people view issues, the power that their own people have over their governmental affairs and international affairs. So every time that, you see these and you think, oh man, that ain't got nothing to do with me. It ain't got what's that got to do with me? What they're doing in Venezuela, Brazil, and African countries, that has a lot to do with you, because each one of these countries could be potential allies or allies. And when the United States just goes in there and handles their leaders like that, coups and anything else, you need to be talking about human rights violations. You need to talk about war crimes. You need to be talking about, aggression versus these nations, because you want these nations to have your back when you come up and say, hey, there's human rights violations in the United States that we want to deal with, that we want to address. The next thing I wanted to take a look at, I got it highlighted, by the any means necessary. And this is from 1970, let me see, 2 or 3, General Assembly. Not necessarily sure. 78. Yes, 78 General Assembly resolution. This could be probably maybe related to Israel, Palestine, these type of declarations. However, but it applies, internationally. The UN reaffirms the legitimacy of struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, liberation from colonial and foreign domination, and foreign occupation by all available means, particularly armed struggle, by all available means. by any means necessary, by all available means. You see the language that Malcolm was using. So a lot of people listen to these speeches and just, that's saying, that's nice, it sound good, it might look good, on a t-shirt, it might, it sound good. Like when you're saying it, it's a rallying cry or whatever you want to say, but specifically under international law, it puts you in a position to have legitimacy in your claims to international respect and international protocols and alignment with international norms and international law. It allows you to say, hey, these people are on the wrong side. These people are a colonial power. The United States is a colonial power. That's when, if you view it, from that angle of the United States being a colonial power, of Black people being colonized within the United States, this gives you the ability to now say, if somebody's subject to mass incarceration, right? And these people in prison revolt, mass incarceration. These people respond to the police a specific way to defend themselves, like the Panthers were trying to do to set up in the communities to defend themselves from the police, like certain gangs did early on, right? Out, before they kind of got started in, drugs and stuff like that, defending themselves from the police. That these ways of self-defense by any means necessary from a colonial power are legitimized under international law and international standards, right? So now I want to go take a look at some of these treaties that were done, just to show what I want to show here by looking at these treaties. Is basically, we want to take a look at the National Negro Congress Treaty, the Civil Rights Congress, We Charge Genocide, and the NAACP. I'm not going to read these, like I said, I'm not going to read all the way through them. I'm just going to take a look at them. I'm going to tell you where online. I might make them available underneath the video. Where online you could take a look at these if you want to read them yourselves. But I know people are probably not going to read them, so that's why I'm just going to go through and just take a look at some of the highlights, some of the little points, kind of, so you could take a look at it, so you kind of get an idea of the historical context of what was happening after the UN was founded and what Black leaders were doing at that time, and how this affects you today, and how this affected obviously Malcolm and his movement when he broke off from the Nation of Islam, right? So Malcolm X was with the Nation of Islam, which was a separatist type of movement, kind of, a la Garvey. And once he had his dispute, once he traveled to Mecca, once he traveled to Africa, once he kind of got put on game by a lot of these African leaders, by, just started educating himself more and looking outside of the organization, once he started looking at ways and opportunities, he came to a very similar conclusion to what people were already doing before they were targeted by McCarthyism during that era, right? And I might take a look at that as well, my page on targeting, because what you'll see was that during this era following the World War II and the founding of the UN also coincided with the McCarthy era and with the McCarthyism as well, and the targeting basically of anti-communism. Because like I said, noted in my last video, sometimes when I use those interchangeably, but anti-communism, Red Scare, second wave of the Red Scare during this era coincided with these groups, and anti-communism as well, because the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, from an international perspective, China, some of these other countries who were fighting, as if you watched my last video, for self-determination globally in Africa and elsewhere, were socialist movements, but they're nationalist movements. They're fighting for self-determination. And these types of countries were willing to help, obviously Black people in the United States, because, Black people were fighting for their own self-determination, their own legitimacy, their own rights to get treated right. But at the same time, these other countries probably also had some, type of interest in the way that the United States acted with regard to them, right? They got troops in their territory fighting proxy wars around them, interfering with their self-determination, even the larger states like the Soviet Union, right? So I'm going to go ahead and get this page up. Well, what I basically want to take a look at is my source notes. At least one of these notes will have all of the proper treaties on there. Okay, here we go. Bang. Okay. So these are some notes that I have for my draft of a petition or outline for reparations domestically, which was a quick kind of like solution type thing for reparations, but also what it was something that could be used to petition internationally. And I covered the international laws, as you can see right here on the first page of the Constitution Declaration. A lot of this stuff I just put in there, so I had to keep the links, right? Because it's educational. So every time I want to take a look at a lot of this stuff, I got it on me. As far as, you know, when I need sources, when people ask about stuff, when I want to do a video, like all this, right? About the slave trade, about wealth built off of slavery, about, you know, nations' GDPs, about forming of the UN, about the historical petitions, which we're going to cover, right? But let's take a look at first. Let's take a look at the Covenant on Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, right? The UN treaties, the International Covenant, like I mentioned, and all these treaties you want to see right here. As long as these links are still good, you're going to be able to get these, right? See, take a look at these links, right? These are all the treaties, United Nations Treaty Collection, treaties.un.org, right? This is a database of all the treaties, or at least not, maybe not, probably not. Heck, it could be all of them. I don't know how many of them is on here, but this is for human rights. You can take a look at them. Now you can see the first one, like I mentioned. Obviously, they had a declaration, they had their charters, Declaration for Human Rights and the charters. But the big one right here was the Convention on the Punishment and the Crime of Genocide. Right. This is what they were using in We Charge Genocide, which was actually the last one that they did. And obviously, because you could see that this was 1948 when this one was out. Some of the ones I think was the National Negro Congress, and all these petitions were led by communists. I want to keep in mind. The Communist Party kind of used the National Negro Congress sort of as like a front to try to get this stuff without getting subjected to anti-communism, as well as the Civil Rights Congress as well. But it was led by black leaders as well. So William Patterson and Du Bois, people like Paul Robeson. Let me see who else. Those are the kind of the main ones. The main people that people would know today. So let's take a look at this one real quick. Okay, it's this tiny one here. Let me go. There we go. And a lot of people, when they think about genocide, think of like ethnic cleansing as in killing like pretty much everybody, but that's not necessarily what it was. It's not the same really. It's a means of, you know, ethnic cleansing and getting rid of an entire population of people, but that's not specifically what genocide is. A killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm. Okay, mental harm. A lot of people don't think about that when they think about genocide, but mental harm. So killing members of a group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of a group. And even in the first part, we say the genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. In whole or in part, right? So in part, not in whole. So it doesn't have to be intent to destroy the whole group, part of the group, just any ethnic or religious group. Well, actually, it says right there, any national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions. So conditions is a big thing as well. Conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, right? Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group and enforceable transfer of children. And it's, you know, you'll see genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, indirect and public incitement to commit, attempts to commit, and complicity, right? And then the other ones, the other relevant ones, as far as under a treaty internationally, is going to be the one on civil and political rights. There's ones for economic rights, rights of children, a lot of that. But the ones for civil and political rights is the next big one. This is where they cover self-determination. All people have a right to this, have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that, they can freely determine their own political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. They have the right to, for their own end. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligation arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principles of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may people be deprived of its own means of subsistence, right? And it goes on to establish, but that's another big one. Another big one is against racial discrimination, eliminating all forms of racial discrimination, right? Let me take a look at the treaties really quickly. During this time period, it was right after the World War II, the UN was founded, and the first to do a petition was the National Negro Congress. A petition to the United Nations on behalf of 13 million oppressed of the United States of America, June 6th, 1946. You'll see the link here. Okay. And you can get this on like the Internet Archive and stuff, right? See archive.org. So you go to archive.org and you put in NNC petition, and you'll see this come up. And you'll see what they basically, this is a short one. Like when you file like a human rights complaint, it has to be relatively short. What the other ones were like the William Patterson, the We Charge Genocide was a book, like a long book. And Du Bois, kind of being a scholar that he is, he looked over chapters and they did a chapter like basically 100 pages or something like that. But this one was a really short one, like kind of to the point. They referenced the preamble to the charter and stuff like that. The jurisdiction of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations and their charters. Subject matter of this petition is concerned with the protection of minorities and the prevention of discrimination on grounds of race, with the purview of a report commission. Okay. The basis and scope of the relations of the United Nations to the problem of racial oppression and the protection of minorities has been definitely stated in various and official declarations and reports of the United Nations, right? So reference preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental rights and the dignity and the worth of the human person and the equal rights of men and women of all nations, large and small. And see what they're forming here by going over this, and the importance of going over this is to see that the purpose of the United Nations, that the United Nations has an obligation under international law as the purpose to frame this issue, to respond to these issues. And if you put pressure on basically, the United Nations to view these issues as human rights issues, then they do have obligation to act. Now, they might not act. They might do nothing. They might ignore you, but they have an obligation to act under their own charters, under their own protocols, to do something. And this one is pretty short. Like I said, the facts, they put populations, family incomes, occupations, housing, education, civil liberties being violated, obviously, peonage and violence. But this one was quickly submitted. This was almost immediately after the UN was founded. This is 1946. The UN was founded. Let me see how ready I could stay with this. Forming of the UN, the United Nations was into existence in October 1945. History of the United Nations. Say all this stuff ready right here. In January, the United Nations coined. October 24th, 1945, the UN, the United Nations, officially comes into existence, right? And then in like I said, in 1946, they come quickly with the petition. So the next one that they did was, or not, they did a different group, the NAACP, when Du Bois was let back on the NAACP before he got kicked out again. This is 1947, an appeal to the world. And this one is pretty nice. Du Bois writes the introduction, a statement on the denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal to redress. See, this is called appeal to the world. The world. So Du Bois was an international figure from basically the start of his, career. He went to school in Germany, Berlin, University of Berlin, I think it was. So he was traveling around, from to other nations earlier on, France, other places in Europe. He ended up traveling, I think, to China and the Soviet Union, all around the world. Africa, obviously, he died in Africa. So that he lived there like later in his life. So he was really an international figure, and he understood from the beginning the purpose of international these type of issues, fighting for even to the extent for the boys specifically. Why I let you take a look at the chapters basically, so you can see what they was covering. He was basically, from the beginning, even fighting for decolonization of African countries, like way back. So because he lived a long time, he was like 95 years old by the time he died. A lot of people don't really think about that, but he lived basically from the era of Reconstruction all the way through Reconstruction, as like a child, college age, probably about like in the late, like turn of the century into adulthood, as a young man working for the NAACP in like the 20s all the way up to the 60s. Well, I guess he was kind of middle aged, and then, during the 60s he was an old man. And then, you know, like lately in his life, around the time of the March on Washington, he passed away. So, I mean, he lived a long life, and he gave a lot for the struggle, for these issues, and the denial of legal rights. It covers the denial of legal rights from 1787 to 1914. In this, they cover Supreme Court cases. It covers legal status, present legal and social status, patterns of discriminations of fundamental human rights, charters, provisions, rights of minorities. So it covers some of the same stuff, but just a lot more detail than the first petition. It talks about going all the way back to slavery, and there's some language that there were citizen residents of America, the nation who formed largely a segregated caste with restricted legal rights and many illegal disabilities. They are descendants of Africans brought to America during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and reduced to slave labor, right? So that's kind of like an ADOS type, like way before ADOS. They're using this type of language, right? Because this is a longer language, obviously, than just saying like descendants of slaves or anything like that, descendants of slavery. But he uses more eloquent language that say the same thing. They are descendants of Africans brought to America during the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries and reduced to slave labor, right? So descendants of enslaved Africans in America, right? So this group has no complete biological unity, but varies in color from white to black, and comprises a great variety of physical characteristics, since many of them are offsprings of white Europeans as well as Africans and American Indians, right? See, this is another thing that a lot of people ignore about, back basically today, right? When you say black people today, you think like, like just, dark skinned people, but when slavery was set up, from, into like a racial caste from, involuntary servitude, where they was using, white indigenous servants, and they transferred, in the United States to slavery, and got involved in the slave trade. When Britain got involved in the slave trade, basically, they had a number of different laws, and I'll cover this in a different video more in depth, but they had a number of different laws. One in particular was making sure that the slave status was tied to the female, the woman, the black woman who was a slave. They would tie that slave status to her offspring through her. So it basically said, in the legal frameworks of like Virginia, for example, where if like an English, or whomever was a slave owner, had relations, rape, whatever you want to call it, with a female slave, then the child that was a result of that relationship would automatically have slave status, right? So if you follow that chain, and a popular example would be Sally Hemings, the Thomas Jefferson situation, right? Because I think she was like 1/4 maybe African. I think it was her mother, maybe her mother was also had a similar type of relationship, and then or maybe even her grandmother and her mother, and then her children were born slaves. You think about it, but they might have been like 1/4 or an eighth African, right? And 1/4 or eighth African is like, I mean, physically, like in terms of like, like traits and color of skin, is going to be basically not indistinguishable with a white person. Like you see certain people when you're like, oh, that you can see that they kind of got black in them, but you don't that they're not like dark skin black, but you can see even if they're light skin that they got black in them, right? Well, back then, the slave status was tied to that. It wasn't like there was like basically obstacles even in the way of slave owners who might have had children that they wanted to kind of do right by, right? They'd have to send them off. They'd have to do it basically illegally because the slave status legally was tied to the mother. So the kids was born slaves, even though they might have been white. And that status that carried out through the 20th century all the way until civil rights movement all the way through basically. If you look at some older individuals like Ben Jealous or Rock Newman or somebody who they kind of identify as black, but have maybe by DNA maybe they're like 20% African, right, ancestry. But this is acknowledged by Du Bois here, this type of diversity. And a lot of people also ignore the fact that even in people like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, that is kind of like circulated, it's kind of expected that their fathers were European, either slave owners or I guess overseers or whomever. They don't. I mean, I don't really know their specific situations, but that went throughout, and obviously Malcolm X had a similar type of situation. From this type of rape culture that existed back when slave owners basically kind of having their way, and this rape that carried on for all these years led to this type of situation. Where today, obviously it's kind of with a lot of people in inner cities, there's a lot of people who are more light skinned than Africans, but there's obviously a lot of people also who are darker, and there's kind of lesser because of after the 60s and stuff like that, a lot of people who could pass as white ended up kind of just marrying white again, and then by that time a lot of those people basically identify as white today, right? And they're not tied to that slave status anymore. But back then, that was less of an option, and a lot of those people were still tied to that slave status all the way up until like probably around like the 60s and stuff. And some people even still today and like a lot of rural areas will identify as black, despite, obviously not being, dark skinned, or being able to be passed for white, still identify as black. I mean, I saw a video about this the other day. It's kind of funny to an extent. People kind of make fun of it a little bit, but that was, the status of people back then and throughout. And in here they cover, a lot from, Supreme Court cases. I mean, definitely take a look at these if you haven't already read these type of documents. Take a look at them, go through them, see what you think. See what you think of the arguments. How we could use them today. There's a lot of good stuff about the Supreme Court, about the Constitution, about how they view these specific issues with regard to. I mean, he covers, like you can see right here where I'm at the appendix, the chapter where he covers 32 Supreme Court decisions. So when you hear Claude Anderson talk about the Supreme Court, in these different cases, they're covering these cases. This is a source that you could go to in addition for education. And let me go to this last one. This is the big one that a lot of people reference, is the William L. Patterson, We Charge Genocide, the crime of government. This is the Civil Rights Congress. This was 51, obviously re-released in 70. But let me blow this one up. Here we go. And this one, he covers it with regard to genocide. This is specifically the perspective that I would take, and trying to get international grievances. Obviously, it covers the things that I covered earlier about killing members of a group, the psychological impact, murders of Jim Crow. I mean, you think about Jim Crow, you think about today, the psychological manipulation that from media against black people, from just like the symbolic nature of the lynching was a psychological weapon, psychological warfare, basically. The disinformation, the control of media, the control of music. I mean, those are all mental aspects. I mean, just think about playing in the NBA, for example. That's something that you look at, or being a rapper. That's something that you look at as black people who are more well off, basically millionaires. But at the same time, they're part of organizations that are owned and controlled by, predominantly white men, predominantly the dominant white society. So even from that perspective, as far as owning and controlling our own resources, this doesn't happen. And the type of mental warfare and impact that could have through what type of content gets out, right? Because if the people okay in the content, okay in what type of music we listen to, okay in, the rules of the game, right? Of the, we're playing professionally even, the type who has control over, think about the bodily harm that NFL players go through, right? Who had control to the information about, CTE and, permanent brain injuries and all this other stuff that was happening over all these years, right? And then you got your kids playing, Pop Warner, bitty league football and all this other stuff. And, they knew about these permanent brain injuries for how long, it's that type of stuff. And that stuff adds up and adds up and adds up. Forget even the assassination campaigns. And then, you got things like abortion, and you got the death rate discrepancies. You got all this stuff. And I cover all this stuff in my petition that they don't really cover here, because obviously after this, what happened? This was McCarthy era, and that's the last thing that I'm going to cover. You could read this again. This is on archive.com. We Charge Genocide 1970, William L. Patterson. But in here again, another thing, one of the things I cover, and you can see all the stuff that I cover in here, as far as documenting a lot of this redlining. I mean, creates conditions, right? And I got a COINTELPRO, obviously, like I said, what did McCarthyism transfer into? COINTELPRO, right? And that lasted, it ended in the 70s, but then what happened after the 70s? Mass incarceration, right? And I got mass incarceration one here. Look at the mass incarceration rates up to 1970. Here's when COINTELPRO ended around 71, right? What happens after that? Right? They just transitioned. You can see, all men, black men right here, right? Look at this comparison. Sentencing Project. These are all good resources to use. Mass incarceration, the war on drugs, the death penalty discrepancies, police killings and targetings, right? Police killings and targetings, homicide rates. Look at the homicide rates. This is white. Total black, white. Huge discrepancies. Inhumane conditions. Promotions again, the promotion of gangs, drug trafficking, uh, drug policy, the punishment of drugs, destruction of the black family, black communities, social programs, how social programs, were targeted, the way immigration policy is designed, environmental impacts, medical impacts, diabetes, deaths from lung cancer, or just cancers in general, I guess. Yeah, 50% more in lung cancer as well. This is from things like W.E.B, from the CDC. So this is their own statistics saying that, these type of disparities exist. Homelessness. Look at this homelessness. And when you look at a lot of these statistics, one thing to keep in mind is that black people are only 12% of the population, 15% of the population. So you're dealing with, 50% versus, that's way more than double. Okay, and you're talking about poverty. You're talking about poverty and unemployment. Look at these discrepancies, right? This is everything. Everything that could be negative, there's discrepancy. Everything that could be positive, obviously, it's in the opposite direction, right? The wealth gap. Okay. So let me go back. Last thing that I want to take a look at is these individuals targeted, right? Because during this era, like I mentioned, these individuals were involved with these petitions. Paul Robeson was attacked, blacklisted, hounded by the government for his political beliefs. And this is a quote from Black History Month Tribute, Democracy Now! He was attacked, blacklisted, hounded by the government for his political beliefs for years, was tracked by the FBI as well as the CIA, Department of the State, for numerous other government agencies, together tens of thousands of documents on him, right? Which they used to bring him before McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee. In 49, he was effectively blacklisted. In 50, the government revoked his passport. See, this was around the same time of the We Charge Genocide, and these other petitions were going around. They revoked his passport so they couldn't travel, right? So if you're trying to build an international movement, but then you can't travel, to other countries and have discussions with other leaders and stuff like that. If you're either stuck in the United States or you're stuck in another country, you can't come back to the United States, right? Whatever the situation. The Bois, okay, put him on trial, branded him as un-American. This is from W.E.B. Du Bois was un-American. Boston Review. This is just quotes. They put Du Bois on trial, branded him as un-American. A federal judge acquitted him because it failed to provide any evidence. And one of these cases was actually one of the ones, I think, that if I'm wrong, I'm not sure, but that Albert Einstein was going to, Albert Einstein was going to show up as a character witness for Du Bois. So, I think once they found that out, it was like, well, one of the, the people, one of the guys is basically synonymous with being a genius is going to show up, and, I don't think that's going to work with any type of jury or judge is going to say. But Patterson, okay. Patterson, civil rights Congress leader charged with the State Department, has stolen his passport. Right, this is from the Washington Afro-American 52, but also the New York Times as well stated this type of stuff. Right, Patterson, civil rights Congress leader, charged with State Department stolen his passport. He also charged that they've been snubbed at the Paris UN meeting, right, and that none of the books were delivered that were supposed to be delivered to the meeting. But he also got jailed as well. He got jailed for contempt. Yes, jailed for contempt for related to them attacking the Civil Rights Congress, I'm pretty sure. when it was going out the Civil Rights Congress, they said he wasn't providing all the documentations and stuff like that, like he was supposed to be, or whatever type, nonsense. So he ended up getting jailed after this, right? And then we go into the era where, where obviously Malcolm X got assassinated, Martin Luther King assassinated. All these leaders were either going to jail or going to prison and getting assassinated. Fannie Lou Hamer got beat pretty badly. Particularly Carmichael left the country. Regardless of what you think about him, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark obviously were assassinated. Huey Newton was in jail at one point in time, got out. He later got killed. All these people, all these leaders, O.J. Cleaver, again, regardless of what you think about him, obviously what he did later on, Bobby Hutton, Kathleen Cleaver, UCLA shooting of Prentice Carter and John Huggins, Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, was targeted as part of the Panther, Panther 21, Lumumba Shakur, Mutulu Shakur, Sekou Odenga, was part of the Brinks armed robbery thing, where they got them, sentenced them to that. That was connected, I think, Asada Shakur was connected to some of that stuff. She ended up having to leave the country, living in Cuba. H. Rap Brown, targeted again, in prison. Geronimo Pratt, won a case, I think. Johnny Cochran might have been his lawyer. Yeah, led by Johnny Cochran. And he actually, this was Tupac's godfather. I think it was his godfather, or something like that. He had a relationship with Pac. So all these people actually was connected to Pac, and Pac eventually was targeted in the 90s as well by police and military intelligence. If you take a look at John Pottish's book, what is it called? FBI War Against Tupac and Other Black Leaders, right? Jonathan Jackson and George Jackson, Angela Davis. I think Angela Davis just had a birthday, or something like that, either yesterday or a couple of days ago. The Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson case, where Angela Davis actually, I think, is where she was put on trial as well. All these people were targeted during this time period, and they were all international in their framework. Some less than others, but especially with Malcolm. And a lot of these people were influenced by Malcolm. One thing people don't know, or maybe I don't know, a lot of people should know this, but when like I covered in my last video, when Malcolm left the nation, one of the things that happened was that he ended up when he split, people ended up coming with him, which he mentions. And so he left the nation, and then people who came with him, some of those people actually end up in Sekou Odenga, Yaki, Gaddafi, from the Outlaws, right? I think it's his father. And, he had a relationship with Pac too, right? Because him and Pac were like, I don't know if there's actual cousins, but, they grew up together, right? Because their parents were both in the struggle. All the family was in the struggle like that, right? Asada Shakur and everybody, right? Tulu Shakur. So a lot of the Shakur clan came, I think through, man, let me forget this man's name. I think Salahuddin Shakur was one of the first Shakurs, was actually, one of them people who is split from the nation with Malcolm, right? And that movement got started, right, with the Shakurs. That went all the way, I think of Afeni Shakur and Pac, right? Pac was born in the 90s. Pac was still on that revolutionary stuff from that, and they was still targeting this Pac, right? Pac got beat up by the police and all that stuff. If you watch my other videos, right, on how Pac was targeted. So this all comes back together, and for targeting this long, for killing people for this long, right? This is a human rights violation. That's if you get anything out of the video, especially what I was talking about earlier on, is we had to start articulating it like Malcolm X was articulating it, for our rights to be recognized internationally, and for us to have those leverages even if the UN doesn't do anything about it, right? We had to petition. We have to let our voices be heard and articulate it within that way, even as we fight civilly, right? So we still fight for rights domestically, for reparations, ADOS, and all these other movements, right? But frame it internationally. Frame it so everybody could be our allies. Frame it so that we're taking a fight to the United States from everywhere and not just restricted to, you know, just fighting the United States alone with no other international pressure. And that's what I want to get out of this video. You know, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, whatever. But I'm gonna keep coming with these videos as much as I can, as much resources I can provide. I'll try to provide links. I mean, you know, this is a little bit difficult for me to do these all the time, but I want to try to, you know, get some more of this stuff out there.